Well, hello, good people. One of the questions I get quite a bit is, what's the difference between samplers? Well, today we're going to take a look at that. So first off, what are samplers? Basically, it's a mathematical calculation, and the differences between them are basically numbers, but you can also see them visually. For most of the samplers that you see on Playground, a good core group of them will end up looking the same with higher prompt guidance and steps. And usually the differences are very minute, with some exceptions. Also, you might hear them be called schedulers, basically the same thing. And for this demo, what I did was use the same seed, the same prompt in some of these examples, and I'm also going to keep the same order. We have PNDM, otherwise known as PLMS, DDIM, Euler, not Euler. I used to say Euler. Sounds like Bueller. But it's pronounced Euler after a very well-known mathematician, way beyond my knowledge. Next to Euler, we have Hune, DPM2, and then LMS. At the bottom here, I have the ancestral versions, Euler Ancestral and DPM2 Ancestral. Off the bat, I'm going to tell you both ancestrals tend to be more creatively different than the others. However, PLMS and DDIM can also sometimes be slightly more creative. But if you look at these four here, you will see that they're very similar with slight differences. If we look at PLMS, DDIM, and Euler, you see that they're very different. And that's why I was saying that these two, sometimes they look similar and sometimes they're off doing their own thing. DDIM looks more like Euler. Again, you see the slight differences. The arm is kind of weird here, but in terms of the design of the shirt, very small differences, but still very evident. Whereas with PLMS, looks like a different person, same colored outfit, but the details vary quite a bit. I'm going to leave Euler in sight for now because I want to show you Hune and DPM2. These three tend to look the most similar. But if I move this over and show you LMS, you see that LMS tends to look more like Euler in terms of the details. So we've got this little kind of like a Nike swoosh here. LMS has it, but we see Hune and DPM2 look very, very similar. I'm going to bring in Euler again here. And the one thing I want you to realize here, if you look at the face and the overall color and texture of the image, Euler is known to kind of be a bit more smoother. It likes to blend colors more gradually. If we zoom in here, you see that the face is just a bit softer than Hune. And it also has more of a softer face. And it's even getting some of the orange on the face. Whereas with Hune and DPM2, they tend to be just a tad sharper on the final output. Regarding the ancestral versions, Euler and DPM2, with this particular image, you see that Euler Ancestral looks very different from the rest, but it keeps certain characteristics like the color of the tracksuit, whereas DPM2 Ancestral, totally different color, totally different face, different hairstyle, as with Euler Ancestral, but it almost looks like it's a different prompt. These two are often referred to as being more chaotic or more creatively artistic. I do find though with Euler Ancestral, it's one of my favorites, that it adheres to prompts more literally. That's not always the case, but usually I find that it'll pick up the smaller details better than DPM2, for example. By the way, these images were done with Playground V1. Now the other thing to consider is the type of model or filter you're using. In this set, we're using realistic vision. Once again, we see similarities from before where PLMS is just a bit more different than DDIM and Euler here, where Euler and DDIM look very similar. Looking at Hune, DPM2, and LMS, we see the similarities between these two, and this one looks more like Euler. And I actually like the skin texture and color a bit better with LMS. And then we have our outlier ancestral versions, Euler ancestral, DPM2 ancestral. What I find very interesting, DPM2 ancestral here, with the same prompt guidance and steps, creates an image as if she's not wearing any makeup, which is totally fine. Nothing wrong with that. But it looks a lot more natural, I would say. With Euler Ancestral here, we've got a cleaner face. Looks like she's wearing a bit of makeup, a bit of foundation and blush maybe. Yes, I know about foundation. So you know how earlier I said PLMS and DDIM can sometimes be a bit more creative? This is a good example of that when using RPG as a filter. But you see the tracksuits are very different between the two compared to the rest. Even the hairstyles, the composition, and the scene itself, very different. And this tends to happen every now and then. But in this case with RPG, we see PLMS, DDIM, Euler. These three look very similar. Let's take a closer look, even down to the little emblems here, some of the smaller details on the leather strip. So in this case, they're adhering to the prompt just like the other ones. The only difference between the other three, Hyun, DPM2, and LMS, is really just a few small details on the leather here. As expected with Euler Ancestral and DPM2 Ancestral, quite a bit of difference compared to the others. Which sometimes leaves me saying, you know nothing, Jon Snow. Now, what's the point of having different samplers if, let's say, 3 or 4 of them are similar? Most people will say there really isn't any big differences. But to them, I say hogwash. Because when you start to create AI images that are heavily complex and detailed, that's where you could see most of the differences. Now, at first glance, you might think, well, they look pretty much the same. For this particular image, you can actually see a color saturation difference with PLMS here, where these two look naturally a bit more washed out. If you see this little side house here, on this one, it's very different from the other two. Once again with Euler, Hyun, and DPM2, they look the most similar, with the exception of Euler here. The fine details are more rounded off, and the rainbow isn't as distinct here, but for the most part, it looks very similar to these two. I actually prefer Euler Ancestral here. It just looks more cleaner. It's not as detailed as the others, but it looks more put together. You know what I mean? And then DPM2, I actually have in the prompt jelly beans, and it really focused on that for some reason. Now, other than the visual differences, there's also the pre-processing difference. Hyun, DPM2, and DPM2 Ancestral tend to take just a bit longer to process, whereas the rest will generate your images just a bit quicker, and I find DDIM tends to be the fastest. Now that also depends on the server load, and of course if your quality and details are pretty high, that will increase the processing time as well. Now when I first started learning Stable Diffusion, I watched several videos on samplers, and most people said that context didn't matter. But I'd argue it does matter, and it really depends on which model you're using. For example, I almost always use Euler Ancestral, but in this case for this type of prompt, I'm not going to use Euler Ancestral. I might actually even prefer PLMS for this one because I didn't ask for 2 wolves. Even though it looks great, I didn't ask for it. For some reason, the other ones were giving me 2 wolves. Of course, I could put in a negative prompt. Might have to do with the size, all those things, but PLMS was the one that I went with because this is closest to the prompt that I gave it. And then if we look at line art, for example, yes, context matters. As usual, we have our same set that tends to look similar, but look at PLMS. That's not what I prompted. What is that? Although it looks cute, it looks nothing like a cute puppy that I prompted for. And then if I use Euler Ancestral, although this prompt is really simple, I accidentally put in high detail. As I said previously, Euler Ancestral tends to look at your prompt pretty literally. So although the puppy is nice and cute here, that's too much detail for a coloring book. So taking out high detail, now I get something that's more acceptable in a children's coloring book. In all honesty though, I can't sit here and tell you this is the best to use because it's really personal preference. For example, I use DDIM to start when I'm building my prompt just to get my workflow going. Then I'll dial it in either with DPM2, maybe Euler. Between those two and Hewn, maybe the eyes is better than the other. Or if I want something more creative, I'll go with Euler Ancestral, which is the one I kind of use most of the time. And another factor to consider that we didn't talk about today is the prompt guidance and quality and details. We'll get into that in another video because if I got into that, this video would be so long and it would hurt the retention of this video. In case you're new to Playground AI, make sure to check out this video on prompt basics. That's gonna get you started, and then check out the rest of the videos on Playground AI.